Amen. This past month or so, I finally gave into the worldwide phenomenon that is the Game of Thrones. I had resisted for more than 6 years. I even did a wedding somewhat recently where I made a Game of Thrones reference that I did not even understand at the time. The bride and groom were both big fans and slipped it into my script. I think I delivered the line convincingly. But after all of that, my curiosity finally got the better of me, and I began to watch. Well, to simply say I watched is not exactly accurate. I began to binge watch this show, and foregoing sleep within 4 weeks, I had completed all 7 seasons. And now I find myself in the same place as all the rest of the Game of Thrones viewers, waiting 2 years for the conclusion of the series. It was a fun ride. As a preacher, I found myself on more than one occasion thinking, wow, that would be a great sermon illustration. So I suspect this will not be the only time I make reference to this particular show, simply the first. And as such, I will begin by referencing something that most plainly comes through during the opening credits of each episode. The sequence at the start of each episode, if you have not watched, takes us on an aerial tour of the various locations, the keeps, the cities, or the walls around which activities of that particular episode will take place. If you're a Disney fan, it's kind of like a soaring over Westeros kind of thing. There are a couple of those locations that remain constant throughout the show, save for their condition, perhaps. But many of them change over time. The show is, after all, the story of various groups or clans or family houses and how they maneuver with and against one another in this ultimate Game of Thrones. I became intrigued along the way with these particular locations, in particular the keeps and the cities. Each one represents a family or group home, in essence. The King's Landing, for instance, is home to the king and queen and is the capital of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. Winterfell is the home to House Stark and is essentially the meeting place for all of the northern families. And it goes on. 7 seasons. Each one is its own community of sorts, like other cities in both fiction and non-fiction realms. And each one is surrounded by some sort of protective barrier. Most often a wall, but sometimes mountains or a large body of water. And in each case, these barriers are designed to keep outside threats away from the community. The ultimate example of this in Game of Thrones is the wall itself in the extreme north. It is a 700-foot high wall that has served as the barrier to the ultimate outside threat for apparently 8,000 years. There's a lot to this. What intrigues me about all of these borders, all of these walls, and I think I can say this without spoiling anything for those of you who have not seen the show, is that not a single one of them is truly impassable. At some point, something gets past, something gets in. You see, my friends, these walls, these borders, these boundaries we create offer only the perception or the idea of limits or definition. In reality, something will always pass over or under or through. And that is how it should be. For what lays within the wall and what lies on the other side are not and cannot be unrelated. All of that was rolling around in my head as I pondered the question this week, what does it mean to be a community church? Well, to answer that question, one might start by breaking the phrase down into its component parts, community and church. Paul, as we know, did a great deal of writing about the Christian faith, and in particular, of what it meant to be the church. We receive a great deal of wisdom and opinion in the numerous letters that he is purported to have written. Throughout the Pauline writings, we read instructions like in our passage today about how the members of the church are to care for one another, to bear one another's burdens, to be taught the word, and to share in all good things. And as he often does, Paul in today's passage explains the benefits we will receive for such practices. For we will reap at the harvest time if we do not give up. Perhaps this is nothing more than a teaser, for you see, in your bulletin, your announcement insert talks about next week's sermon, which is entitled, Be the Church. So we'll get more into that side of it next week. But what I want to focus on in my remaining time this morning is the idea of being a community church. I think it's a worthy question for us, especially here where we literally have the words community church in our name of our congregation, and especially now when the idea of community may have different meanings to different people. In Game of Thrones, the concept of community is, in some ways, bound by those walls or boundaries we spoke of earlier. You hear reference to the people of King's Landing or the various houses or kingdoms at play at various points in the story, and each one represents a community. But we also learn is that those communities change. As new communities come into being, others swell and prosper, while still others decline and go completely out of existence. The definition of the community evolves over time as the boundaries prove permeable or even irrelevant. I think of scenes where leaders in this show stand atop their high walls with enemies surrounding them, and they speak of how their walls have never been breached. And then we watch as those words prove almost comically timed, and the outsiders find their way past these impassable boundaries. Not to mention the changing allegiances and loyalties that demonstrate just how dynamic these supposedly well-defined communities really are. As it relates to the church and our faith, I believe that Paul gives us a hint about what community might mean. Recognizing that even in the most well-defined communities, people will come and go. And with that movement, there will be changes in the face and practices of the community. Paul does not even attempt to address that reality. Instead, he writes these words, "Whenever we have an opportunity, let us work for the good of all, and especially for those of the family of faith." Our sense and understanding of community is to be truly expansive, not tightly defined. Like the message of Jesus in the parable of the Good Samaritan, when we ask the question, who is our neighbor, and we enthusiastically answer, everyone, so too should we answer the question about what is our community from the perspective of our faith. It is everywhere. It's not only this collection of souls in this sanctuary, or even all the names that appear in our directory. Our community is that, of course, but the boundaries of that community are not rigid and impassable. They are quite, in fact, permeable. As we welcome others in and simultaneously venture out to fulfill Paul's call to work for the good of all. Yes, it is true that Paul offers special consideration for the family of faith. And that, my friends, is why we engage in ministry on this site, why we have done so for the past 60 years, offering ministries of faith formation for children, for youth, and for adults seeking to embrace opportunities for lifelong faith formation. Offering ministries of mutual care and compassion for those who are struggling with injury or illness, for those who have suffered loss, and for those who are struggling to find a place of true, unconditional welcome and affirmation. Offering ministries of spiritual and cultural engagement for those seeking to worship, to encounter the divine, or simply to have their hearts touched. Offering ministries of fellowship for those seeking a sense of connection and deep relationship, hoping to experience the love of God within a community of God's people. But we also must always expand our vision as we seek the good for all, taking down whatever walls we might construct that might obstruct our view of the broader community of which we are a part, and step beyond our boundaries out into that community where we are called to feed the hungry, not simply ensure that our needs are met, but share our resources to ensure that all people in our community are fed. Where we are called to educate the children, not just those who walk into our Sunday school classrooms, but those who are struggling to read and learn in our broader community. Where we are called to protect the vulnerable, not just those whose names we know, but those who must remain anonymous for their own safety, but are still part of our community. Where we are called to stand with the marginalized and oppressed, not those who experience a false sense of oppression due to a threat to their privilege, but those who lack a true sense of agency within our community. My friends, this is what it is to be a community church in this time and in this place. It's not an island in the midst of a frightening sea, but an outpost offering hope and help in a much larger community where both are so desperately needed. It is a place for comfort, yes, but not a place to simply be comfortable. We are the Manhattan Beach Community Church. And our identity, our mission is right there in our name. We are here. We exist in ministry with and for our community in the broadest sense of the word. In Game of Thrones, one of the trends that you witness over time, and one that is not at all surprising when you think about it, is the constant pursuit of alliances. You hear repeatedly that winter is coming. It is an ominous message that permeates the show over and above the more petty squabbles. The only way to prepare for winter is to expand the circle, not contract. There's far too much at stake. Similarly, the only way to fulfill our identity as a community church is to expand our sense of community, not contract. There's far too much at stake. Besides, when have we allowed ourselves to be so narrowly defined? Amen.